Hi everyone, I hope everyone is doing well. A while ago, I made a community post highlighting a strategy method that I call the hierarchy of vulnerability. And judging by the comments, I don't think the viewers were really understanding the strategy I was trying to present, so I decided to make a video on it to clear it up. The hierarchy of vulnerability is a direct core tenet of what players have been referring to as the lineup method that I pioneered and presented earlier in my channel. The lineup method is essentially a style of play in which you are strategically sequencing your Pokemon to maximize your utility, as opposed to the more standard play style in OU, which is too heavily reliant on team builds and the strength of Pokemon and the ability to heal. So I find that there's a problem in the OU tier in which players are becoming too comfortable with the strength of their team or the strength of their Pokemon or their ability to heal their Pokemon and wall certain threats. So they are more tempted to switch around, and they're looking for an instant gratification type of scenario. These players are making decisions based on what is directly in front of them. So if they see an optimal play in the moment, they're more likely to take it. So if they can block something, or if they have an optimal matchup against the opponent's Pokemon, they're going to take it. If they see an opportunity to heal something, they're going to take it. If they see an opportunity to save a Pokemon they deem important based on its strength and switch it out into something more comfortable, save it for later, they're going to take it. So you could say that these strategies are short-run optimal, whereas they're going to give the player an immediate advantage by making these moves, whereas the lineup strategy accepts the necessary sacrifices that you need to take to give yourself the best long-run success, the best long-run situation. And you can see this being utilized when I run the teams that I do. I run random teams, I run bad teams, and I'm trying to milk the maximum utility out of every Mon that I have. And the way I do that is I sequence them a certain way in which I can line up the opponent for an early, mid, end game scenario in which they lose and I win, even though they had the more powerful Pokemon to begin with. And I would say this is just the fundamental of Pokemon in general, since Pokemon is a turn-based strategy game. So when it first came out, that was the intention behind it. And in Gen 1, obviously, there's many tactics you can use to have extremely strong teams and extremely strong Mons, and this was carried on and blown up in the later generations. I didn't really play any of the later generations, but I've seen them, and I've seen all the kinds of strategies and functions and add-ons that were added on to the core game that really saturated the play style. But really, at its core, Pokemon is a game of switching, sequencing, and tight matchups. The hierarchy of vulnerability is a key aspect of the lineup style of play, and you can't have one without the other. So it's very important that I explain this correctly. The hierarchy is not a team build, nor is it a strict rule set in the order of which you have to use your Pokemon. The hierarchy is a running mental index of 6 assorted Pokemon from the most common threats in the OU meta. The most important aspect of this being that you do not know what the threats are. So when you start the game, you have 6 Pokemon and your opponent has 6 Pokemon. And you need to create a mental hierarchy of which of your Pokemon is going to be the least affected by 6 unknown Pokemon of the OU meta. A good way to measure this would be to go to the Smogon forum of the OU viability rankings and take a look at the actual ranking of the viability of which Pokemon are the best in that tier and plan around that. You can easily access this page by typing /rules space Gen 1 OU in the chat bar, and it'll take you to a menu. You can click the viability rankings, and then it will take you to the forum where you can see the list of Pokemon that are statistically most likely to be used in the meta. So I rolled 5 random teams, and let's go ahead and take a look at the hierarchy for these teams and explain why I have ordered them the way they are ordered. They are ordered from left to right, from least vulnerable to most vulnerable. And I am going to speak about that in detail to give you guys a better understanding of what to use at what point in the game. The hierarchy isn't ironclad either. So as the game goes on, the battle space shifts, and you see more and more of your opponent's team. Therefore, you should be planning on what you should be keeping in the back pocket and what you should be using first. And you're trying to manufacture a situation in which you have the best matchups against that opponent's team as the battle drags on. So the hierarchy is intended for an unknown team, right? So the Pokemon who's least vulnerable against any host of threats. That pool of threats is going to shrink as you go through the game, and you're going to be able to kind of put together an endgame scenario in which the hierarchy changes, right? So it should only be used for a host of unknown threats. Once you know the threats, then you can change your sequencing to benefit yourself and give yourself the best matchup for the mid and end game situation. So let's take a look at our first team. The first 2 Mons are Hypno and Starmie, with Hypno in the first place and Starmie in the second place. And you may be wondering, well, why is Starmie in the second place? Starmie is OU and Hypno isn't. That's not the point. That is not the point of this list. The point of this list is which of these Pokemon are going to be most effective against unknown threats. So Starmie is vulnerable to Electric, and Starmie is fast. So when the game starts, you don't want to put your Starmie in a situation where it gets Thunder Waved immediately. You don't want to put your Starmie in a situation where it gets paralyzed or statused. Whereas Hypno is slow, and Hypno is mono-psychic, meaning it has virtually no weaknesses. Additionally, both of these Pokemon can heal. Hypno has Rest, and it has strong stats to back it up. So it's less of a loss if Hypno gets paralyzed than it is if Starmie would get paralyzed, since Hypno is already slow, and Hypno can rest itself. Additionally, Hypno has access to Hypnosis and Thunder Wave. And it can serve in a similar capacity to Alakazam, in which you can force the opponent to switch out by dropping their special. And you also have the opportunity to catch them on the switch, predict their switch, and Thunder Wave their next switch in. So Hypno serves the best as a lead with this given role. It can cause the most havoc to the enemy team with lower opportunity cost than Starmie. And in second place, of course, would be Starmie. Since Starmie is OU, it's fast, it's hard to kill, it can heal itself in 1 turn, and it has access to Thunder Wave, with its only notable weakness being Electric or Grass. So there is a chance for Razor Leaf on Victory Bell, or Mega Drain on Executor, maybe even Mega Drain on Gengar, right? But again, it's not too common for grass attacking moves in OU. Next up would be Kangaskhan. Kangaskhan is a bulky physical normal type, and as a normal type, it is immune to paralysis from Body Slam, meriting its 3rd place ranking on this team. Additionally, a smart opponent is going to be hard-pressed to switch into Kangaskhan because, much like Tauros, they're going to be risking a strong body slam with a chance of paralysis. Kangaskhan has Earthquake, so it's not walled by Gengar. And again, normal type's only weakness is Fighting type, and that's virtually never used in OU. Fourth place would be Tentacruel. Tentacruel's glaring weakness is going to be Psychic, which is heavily used in OU. Also Ground and Electric. However, Tentacruel is very fast and it has a very high special. These combinations are good because combined with Wrap, it can outspeed most of the slow OU meta and get it stuck in a Wrap cycle. Vileplume would be higher up on the list if it wasn't weak to Psychic and Ice, because Vileplume has Sleep Powder and Stun Spore. And as we discussed in a previous video, the early game in OU should be spent spreading status to the enemy team so that you can bring in your hard hitters with less resistance later on in the game, making Vileplume actually pretty good for early use. But this hierarchy isn't about what you should use first and second. This hierarchy is a guide of what is weak against the enemy meta. So don't take it to heart and think this is the way I must play, because this is just kind of like a diagram. You take this into consideration as you play. However, you're probably going to run into many situations in the early game where it would make more sense to throw out Vileplume first, because you do want to land a Sleep or you want to land a Stun Spore. But objectively speaking, Vileplume is slow, it gets bodied by common attacks, and it has a weak attacking capacity in itself. Last on the list would be Rhydon, and, similar to Starmie, you're like, why would you ever put Rhydon last? Well, Rhydon should be last even on a regular OU team, because Rhydon is unbelievably weak and unbelievably slow compared to everything. Its special is atrocious. Rhydon, you don't want your Rhydon to get bodied early, because that Rhydon could win the game for you in the end game. Rhydon has a massive attack potential. In fact, I think he has the strongest one-click attack in the game with his Stab Earthquake at 358 attack. But I can't drive home enough the point that Rhydon is just so vulnerable to special that it's not even worth using in the earlier mid-game unless you see an opportunity in which you need to break through something and sacrifice the Rhydon in the mid-game so you can line yourself up for a better matchup in the end game. Rhydon also has an additional utility of being able to pivot off of electric attacks, so meaning you'll throw it in and you'll take it back out for something better to confuse your opponent and also avoid maybe a paralysis or a thunderbolt in the process. So if you throw on a Rhydon and your opponent thinks that you're going to commit to it, well, surprise, I'm just jumping off of Rhydon to go into something better. That's another utility that Rhydon or pretty much any ground type has, right? And Rhydon's strong defense rock type as well, so maybe you could use it to block a Hyper Beam and finish something off. But you don't want to keep it in the earlier mid-game, because your opponent is likely going to have something that can completely body your Rhydon. Before we move on to the other teams, there are some important points I would really like to note, in the sense that this method isn't exclusive to random teams or bad teams. This method works for all teams, especially OU teams. So if you're already running a strong OU team and then you start playing with the lineup method or the hierarchy method, you're going to be blowing the ladder out of the water, because you're thinking on a long-term scale as opposed to a short-term instant gratification scenario. So not only do you have a powerful team of OU Pokemon that can heal themselves, but also you're planning them strategically to give yourself the best matchup and maximize each Pokemon's utility before they die. And you're making necessary sacrifices to give yourself the best endgame situation. This is how I'm able to beat strong OU teams with these teams, with bad teams, right? Imagine what you can do if you're running a strong team and you use the same play style. You're going to be a formidable force. You're going to be at the top of the ladder consistently, right? because you understand the fundamentals of a game that is ultimately predicated on sequencing. Another key aspect I want to point out is the hierarchy isn't always focused on high to low. You can also use it in a capacity where it's focused from low to high. Well, what do I mean by that? I mean, if you're put in a situation in which you need to sacrifice a Pokemon, but you're unsure of what your opponent has left in their Pokeballs, you can look on the low end of the hierarchy and say, which of these Pokemon is the weakest or most useless? So I'm going to put that to sleep, right? I'm going to sacrifice that to an explosion. So I'm left with the more powerful Pokemon at the top of the hierarchy to give my opponent the most problems later in the game. I guess the best example of this would be in an Executor matchup, where the Executor is in a situation where it can sleep a Pokemon and also explode on a Pokemon. In that situation, you're going to want to use Pokemon at the lower end of the hierarchy to fight that Executor, so you're left with the best possible hand as the game goes on. From here on out, I do plan to post more commentary videos with more breakdowns, but I was finding it difficult to do so without releasing a video like this first that kind of outlined and well articulated the methods that I'm using to use those random teams and to use those bad teams, the kind of sequencing and decision making I'm using. This is what I'm using. This is the mental blueprint I'm using for all of my games and pretty much what I use to make bad teams work. So I hope to put out some videos in the future where you can see this video in action. All right, let's move on to the second team. So looking at this, Tauros is the best lead I have. Tauros is many consider to be the best in OU. It's very strong, it's fast, often takes 4 hits to take down for most Pokemon. It's normal, so doesn't have a whole lot of weaknesses. Tauros is a great matchup against the 2 most common leads in OU, that being Alakazam and Starmie. So you're going to try to hit them hard, you're going to try to get that body slam paralysis, and you're going to try to go for the finish with the Hyper Beam. Really, Tauros serves to get that status early on with low weaknesses and do some big damage in the process. Now, Golduck doesn't have any status-inducing moves, but it's extremely hard to kill once it gets its amnesia up. Also, it is a terrifying force offensively, especially if you're brave enough to run Hydro Pump. Combined with its amnesia and typing, the Stab Hydro Pump is, I believe, the strongest special attack in the game. Barring maybe Mewtwo, but we're not talking Ubers right now. So Golduck has the number 2 slot based on its durability and strength, essentially, even though it doesn't have any status spreading moves. Magmar is number 3. Fire type doesn't suffer too badly from the commonly used moves in OU. Its weaknesses are going to be ground and water. I generally find that most Starmies don't run Surf. They run a better combination of moves like Psychic, Blizzard, and Thunderbolt. Additionally, Magmar has Body Slam and it has access to Confuse Ray, so you can really give your opponent a hard time early or mid. We've already spoken about Vileplume. Vileplume is ahead of Nidoqueen because Vileplume's ability to spread status. But again, a Vileplume is still very weak to some of the more commonly used moves in OU. Nidoqueen is our ground type. It's still weak to many of the special attacks, including Psychic and Blizzard. And Nidoqueen is going to serve a much better function in the end game, similar to Rhydon, because it can't be Thunderwaved, it can't be paralyzed. So, similar to Rhydon, since Nidoqueen can't be paralyzed, and if it's put in toward the end of the game where most of its weaknesses have been hindered somehow, whether it be Thunderwave or Sleep, Nidoqueen can really shine better. Last is going to be Ditto, because, man, I think Ditto is probably the worst Pokemon in OU, period. Maybe not the worst, I don't know. Beedrill, Hitmonchan, Golbat are definitely up there, but Ditto's whole shtick is copying the enemy Pokemon, right? And it still retains its HP stat, and it'll also copy paralysis, so you'll paralyze yourself in the process. But, Ditto's a gimmick Pokemon. He was, even in the main game, he was a gimmick Pokemon, just to, oh, look at how cool Ditto is, he can transform. But other than that, speaking more practically, you're going to want to use Ditto later on when your opponent has less options to counter your transform. So you might actually run into a situation in the end game where you can copy a Pokemon that the other Pokemon don't have good matchups against. So that's pretty much the only utility for Ditto. And also, I guess you could just put the Ditto straight to sleep if you really hate it that much, which I don't blame you. All right, Persian lead. Not normally a lead and for good reason, but given the rest of the team, I think Persian is the best lead to use. It serves a similar capacity to Tauros, so obviously I put Body Slam on this Persian. Persian's function as a lead is to score paralysis and do damage to the Pokemon. A job that Tauros does better, but we don't have a Tauros on this team, so I picked Persian. Additionally, Persian doesn't have any weaknesses outside of Fighting type, and Persian also has 328 speed and Splash, making it fast, and it gives the ability to break through Reflect. Next is Venusaur. Venusaur is notably weak to Psychic types and Ice types. Venusaur has Sleep Powder. It's not as slow as some of the other sleepers in the meta. It also has access to Razor Leaf, which is dangerous to Starmie, especially dangerous to Slowbro, since it can crit through its Amnesia buff, and Cloyster as well. Additionally, Venusaur can be used in conjunction with Swords Dance, so you could have Body Slam or Hyper Beam to deal some huge damage before you inevitably die. So Venusaur serves as a sleeper and a heavy hitter in the opening game as well. Venusaur is going to be in front of Articuno. Articuno can be quite strong with a Reflect, and it has a Rest as well, but Articuno is frequently walled by Chansey and Starmie early on in the early game. So you're likely going to want to wait to use Articuno even later than some of the other Pokemon on this team, but weakness-wise, that's where it is. Charizard is very weak, but it's in front of Gyarados because Gyarados has a ×4 vulnerability to Thunderbolt, which is like, you don't want to use that too early, or the Gyarados is going to get hit with a Thunderbolt, it's going to be paralyzed and hit with one later. You know, you really want to use Gyarados' attack to your advantage in the late game. Whereas Charizard doesn't suffer ×4 vulnerability to that. It suffers ×4 to Rhydon, but you shouldn't be expecting your opponent to use a Rhydon very early with that Rock Slide. Charizard also has Swords Dance and an access to great physical attacks like Body Slam, Slash, Earthquake, and Hyper Beam, and can be used to deal significant damage to the enemy team before it goes down. It also has Fire Spin, which is common in NU, but Fire Spin only has 70% accuracy. The opportunity to pivot switch isn't completely null, so if you want to run Fire Spin on your Charizard to pivot switch into things, you certainly can, but you are risking that 30% chance to miss. And of course, Jolteon at the end, and I will scream it from the heavens. Don't show your electric type early. Jolteon is dead last because it's completely walled by any ground type, period. You can't do anything with that. So Jolteon's very strong, excellent OU Pokemon, but you don't want to show it early. You want to use it later, right? And I believe I mentioned in a previous video, if you're in a situation where you need to put something to sleep, put your electric to sleep, because if you don't know what your opponent has, they may very well have a Rhydon. And what's your Jolteon going to do anyway against an opponent with a Rhydon that they can throw in and throw out as they please? Nothing. So if the Jolteon is asleep and they had a Rhydon, you already won. Well, not really, but you know. The loss of your Jolteon wasn't a hard hit to your strategy because Jolteon would have been completely blocked anyway by ground type. So save your electrics for last where they belong. Alright, third team. We've already spoken about Tauros. Pinsir in front of Slowbro. What? That's crazy. Why would you do that? Well, it was close. But the ultimate thing being is that Slowbro is unbelievably weak to Thunderbolt and electric-type moves. Where I think Pinsir's only weakness in the meta would be like Fire Blast and Drill Peck, I suppose. But then again, you're not expecting your opponent to throw out Zapdos that early. So, Additionally, you don't want to expose your Slowbro too early to things like Sleep, Explosion, and of course Thunderbolt. Slowbro serves much better in the mid game than he does in the early game if you want to get the most use out of him. On this team, I put Pinsir first simply because he has less common weaknesses. He serves in a similar function to Tauros, albeit on a much lower level. So I would try to use him to get body slam paralysis and hit the opponent hard before the Pinsir dies, and then bring in Slowbro at some point later on. Poliwrath serves similarly to Slowbro. He's weak to Psychic, Electric, and Drill Pick as well. He's weaker than Slowbro, and most Poliwraths don't heal. I think I have Hypnosis on this one as well. But if you had the choice to throw on a Slowbro or a Poliwrath without knowing what your opponent had, most people would pick Slowbro because Slowbro resists Psychic, and it is bulkier than Poliwrath. Talked about Rhydon, and then Onyx is a significantly downgraded Rhydon. So, I mean, Onyx is just really, really terrible. Really a much worse ground rock type than Rhydon is. It does have access to Bind, but Bind is not as accurate as Wrap, so use it sparingly. Last team, we're going to have Wigglytuff as the lead, since Wigglytuff is a normal type, only has one weakness. It also has Thunder Wave, and you can get a Stab, Hyper Beam, and Body Slam, so it serves similarly to a Tauros lead, except it has Thunder Wave, which is really good for the early game. And then we also have Slowbro. Again, I neglected to mention before that Slowbro also has Thunder Wave, so he is, you know, a good early to mid game pick if you want to be sure that you're clear of threats that can hinder him significantly, like Sleep, Explosion, and Thunderbolt. You can use him to block a Psychic and throw out a free Thunder Wave. Charizard we talked about. And this one, I actually made an error on my first post. I put Seaking in front of Machamp. Yes, Machamp does have more glaring weakness than Seaking in the fact that it's extremely weak to Psychic. However, Seaking gets heavily walled by almost everything in the OU meta. It's dang near impossible to break through anything with Seaking that can heal itself because Seaking's move pool is just so atrocious. I'm not saying that it's impossible. You have Double Edge, Hyper Beam, and Agility, and you can also pair that with Blizzard to maybe fish for a Desperate Freeze. But when it comes down to these two, Machamp is going to be the harder hitter of the two. Machamp has a much, much higher capacity to break through the enemy using a tactic to wall you than Seaking, because Machamp just has much better special. It has Submission, which is guaranteed super effective on the big three. It has Earthquake, Body Slam, and a 358 Hyper Beam. So Machamp can be used to break through walls more effectively than Seaking, even though Machamp is weaker more generally than Seaking is. And of course, Magneton at the very back, because you can do absolutely nothing to ground types. And looking at Magneton and Jolteon, you're also consistently blocked by Executor as well. So that is the reason for the electric types being last. In closing, I am pleased to say that I believe my videos have had a significant or noticeable impact on the red, blue, yellow community. I think my viewers are getting a lot out of it. On my last one or two serious ladder grinds, I remember thinking to myself, I don't remember there being this many good players in red, blue, yellow. And I have been noticing of the serious games I have been playing that these players are making moves that I would make. And I'm like, whoa. I see players that are playing with a more long-term mindset and sequencing their teams extremely well, and obviously are getting higher in the ladder with it. So take that for what you will, but I really do think, from what I've seen from the inception of this channel to now, I think that players are playing at a much higher level than they were before I started the channel, back when I did my, back when I was a more regular player in the community. And I think that's a really good thing, because I think Pokemon Red, Blue, Yellow on Showdown, I think there's a lot of gatekeeping that goes on with the information and how to be good at the game. I remember when I was up and coming and I was struggling and I didn't know what to do or how to get better, and there wasn't a channel like mine that kind of just handed someone all the answers. And I was like, man, I really wish that existed. And one day I decided, all right, well, I'm going to make a video for a friend to help him out. And that one blew up, and I just decided to keep doing it. So I really, really hope you're getting something out of this and it's making you a better player, because this kind of thing didn't exist when I started. And I think the reason for that is because people don't want to give away their secrets. They want to be good. They want to be the best. And why would they tell you how to beat them, So I think gatekeeping is just a prevalent thing in all aspects of life, gaming included. And even on the Smogon resources page, you could certainly go on the forums and read all the threads, but there's so much noise in there. There's so much it's like information overload, and there's not really a cut and dry, this is how you're supposed to play. It just kind of lists a bunch of strategies and things of that nature. I really wanted to make a channel that got straight to the point, that cut to the heart of the issues and said, hey, no, this is what you got to do, if you want to be a better player. So think very intently about the sequence of your Pokemon and what you're going to use. Think very intently about their weaknesses, and don't be too quick to give yourself an instant advantage, because that might be a worse thing to do in the long run. So thank you for watching the video. Give it a like if you liked it. Subscribe if you liked it. Share it with your friends. Share it with people who are struggling, trying to get a good foothold in Generation 1. I'll do everything I can to demystify the game for you, because I know it can be a struggle if no one's helping you and they'd rather just keep winning. Thank you again, and I wish you the best.